The start of a brand new series? Or a simple one-off episode? I don't know, but honestly, I just wanted a reason to talk about this subject. I am pretty sure that you all know that war is a large part of the world's history, and a lot of people have a lot of opinions about wars. I myself, being a radical pacifist, and I guess based on your definition, an anti-imperialist, though some people use that term a little loosely. And I'm pretty sure a lot of the people who are watching this channel probably have similar views in regards to war. And this is a perspective that is shared by a lot of people in the United States. And one of the biggest reasons why it is so common is because of many of the quote-unquote wasteful wars done in the history of the United States. The two that are the most cited being the Vietnam War and the Iraq War. I go one step further by making the claim that only 4 wars in the US's history were justified. The Revolutionary War to get our independence, the War of 1812 because we were directly attacked, the Civil War in order to free the slaves and stop the secessionist movement, and World War II to stop the Nazis and because we were attacked by Japan. And rather than talking about the Vietnam or Iraq wars again and again, I want to talk a little bit about a war that most people slip under the radar because these two are regarded as more flashy wars and make the very bold claim that World War I was a mistake. And hopefully this video will briefly go over and explain why I think so. First, let's talk about deaths. War is of course a deadly thing. The amount of people who have died in war coming to around 1 billion in history. In this specific war, the number ranging from around 15 to 22 million. And when you take a look at the percentage of the population, it still doesn't seem that big. But let's do a little bit of a comparison to the modern day. The last population number we had, according to science, is 7.88 billion people. 1.7 of today's population, 133,960,000 people, and 2.3 is 181,240,000 people. To put that into perspective, the
low number
is higher than the population in all but 9 countries, which includes the population of countries like Mexico, Turkey, UK, Canada, among others. And the high number is higher than the populations of Bangladesh and Russia. And this isn't even including the around 23 million people that were injured. And this is the first war where you started to really notice the injuries. Soldiers were coming back with their entire jaws gone, no noses, lost eyes, and those without scars on the outside had scars on the inside, with this being the first war where people started noticing post-traumatic stress disorder, or as they called it at the time, shell shock. Remember, at the time, people called it the war to end all wars, because it was so damaging and so drastic that many people thought there was no way that we could top it. And this is even including the people who died of the Spanish flu pandemic that happened at the time. Although now that I think about it, maybe we should add those numbers, because World War I is the reason why the Spanish flu pandemic was as bad as it was. For those who do not know, the disease that became colloquially known as the Spanish flu was a particular strain of the influenza virus that broke out around the tail end of World War I. It was a particularly bad variant that scientists didn't know what to do with it, and our medical knowledge was not as good as we know now, so we could really do only very basic things to combat it, such as stay at home if you don't have to go out, or if you do need to go out, wear a mask. And I'm sure with very competent leaders in charge of the world during that time period, I'm sure a majority of the countries did everything they could to make people learn this, right? Well, much like a very recent pandemic, that did not happen. And what's worse is that a lot of world leaders simply didn't want people to know about this disease. Because if people were aware that there was a deadly disease that was going around, it would decrease turnout to help support the war. Less boys might be willing to sign up to join the military. Less people would be inclined to send people off to foreign lands where they could possibly catch this disease. And it could overall demoralize people from supporting the war effort, which did not bode well for people in power who really wanted to keep the war going for some reason. So many world governments did everything they could to just not tell people about the disease. I mean, the US literally passed a law that literally said that they could jail people who were criticizing the war effort So hypothetically, if you wanted to say, hey, maybe we shouldn't do this war and we should instead focus on this influenza outbreak, jail time, with many other countries following suit. Hell, the reason why it's called the Spanish flu is because Spain was the only country that was literally calling the attention this outbreak that was happening. So to an outsider, it looked like Spain was the only one that was suffering an influenza outbreak. So hypothetically, if we were to add people who died of the Spanish flu to the death total of World War I, what would that mean? Well, it would add an additional 25 to 100 million people to the death total. That number's gotten really big all of a sudden. And what's worse is the reason why that number isn't bigger, with scientists and historians concluding that the only reason that the Spanish flu did not kill more people was because all of the people who were susceptible to the virus were killed. Such a tragedy. Over 100 million people dying, all to support the war effort. I mean, at least there was a very moral reason to support the war, right? 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 Okay, we all know the story of World War I, right? Conflicts between Austria-Hungary and Serbia led to a Serbian to assassinate Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Austria-Hungary attacked Serbia in retaliation. Serbia is an ally of Russia, so Russia joins in the fight, and then they bring their military allies, who had literally no relation to Serbia at all. Austria-Hungary then decides to bring their allies, and then more countries enter despite little to no reason to get involved. And somehow a conflict that was a dispute between two countries ends with 6 continents. Honestly, I don't think I need to explain beyond that, but I guess we should focus on the aspect of America's involvement in the war, because I'm coming at it from the stance of an American. And it really boils down to like 2.5 reasons. The Zimmerman telegram, and the sinking of US ships off the British shore by German U-boats. The most common one we learn about in school is the Lusitania. Well, let us go over each of those reasons, shall we? First of all, the Zimmerman telegram was an empty threat. Mexico was in no position to get involved in World War I. They were in the midst of the Mexican Revolution and had a very unstable administration. And America knew this, as they were actively taking part in the conflict trying to kill Pancho Villa, a thing that the president of Mexico was goading them to doing. The Mexican government was literally on the brink of collapse due to the internal conflicts. So there was literally no reason for them to get involved in World War I. I mean, sure, we know the incentive for them to get involved, but there was no actual threat to be had. Even more so, considering the Zimmerman telegram explicitly points out that the condition has to be that the US has to get involved in the war as well. So literally, if the US just stayed out of the conflict, there would still be no threat. Now, I know what some of you are going to be typing in the comments, but the U-boats were bombing US ships. Let me ask you a question. What were American ships doing in a freaking war zone? At the beginning of the war, the British Navy set up a blockade in the North Sea and forbade any and all imports into the nation, saying that they were contraband. So in retaliation, Germany did the same thing with the UK, and embassies around the world actively warned that any ships that were in those waters were to be torpedoed on sight. It is still bad for the U-boats to sink the ships, but why was the US government giving the go-ahead for American vessels to enter in a war zone, and allowing citizens to go on British vessels, despite the Secretary of the State even stating that this was a bad idea? Well, that's where we're going to have to get into a little bit of some controversies. One choice controversial statement came from a lowly British MP named Winston Churchill, saying, "Most important to attract neutral shipping to our shores in the hope especially of embroiling the United States with Germany." A bit weird, but whatever. Of course the British wants to egg the US to get involved. The US ended Britain's long-standing claim as the #1 world power, so naturally they want us to be their friends. But the question is, how come Woodrow Wilson didn't heed William Jennings Bryan's warnings about US citizens getting aboard British vessels during the war? Another controversy comes from the Lusitania itself. While yes, it had 1,959 people on board, it also had 4.2 million rounds of Remington .303 rifle machine gun cartridges, almost 5,000 shrapnel shell cases for a total of some 50 tons, and 3,240 brass percussion artillery fuses. Why the heck was an American civilian ship full of ammunition heading towards the UK despite the US not being involved in the war? Well, that leads to a common critique about World War I, that it was all about money. A thing that would become somewhat vindicated with the Special Committee on Investigation of the Munitions Industry led by Senator Gerald Nye, which examined the connection between the war and financial gains of the munitions and banking industries, which made American non-interventionist sentiment grow to almost, if not the exact same levels, to right before World War I began, which was interesting because right around the time the committees were being held, America was contemplating a debate into getting involved with another world war. Speaking of, World War II, in literally every possible way, World War II would have had a completely different outcome had we never got involved in World War I. Neville Chamberlain would have not sought to appease Hitler to avoid another world war. Non-interventionist sentiment in the US would not be as prominent with them using World War I as a justification. The massive amounts of anti-Semitism. Okay, granted, the anti-Semitism would have still been there. I mean, that's a very sad truth. People were very anti-Semitic at the time period. But, as the name suggests, there couldn't have been a number 2 without a number 1, because World War II served as a direct continuation of World War I. Hitler's rise to power was due in large part because we shafted them in the immediate aftermath of World War I. His scapegoat for the Jews was that they were turncoats who stabbed them in the back during World War I, that they were the reason why Germany lost. Hard to exploit that if there's no reason to. Hitler wouldn't have been able to run on a military record because what was his service? World War I. He would have just been some random artist that you'd look up on Wikipedia and be like, oh yeah, this dude had some really crazy views. Not a guy whose actions would lead to over 85 million people dying. So, to recap, World War I was not only a completely useless war, but also, had it been avoided, we could have prevented the deaths of 207 million people, give or take. Thanks for watching this video. Be sure to like, comment, share, subscribe, and click the bell to notify when a future video of mine comes out. And if you're interested in more content from me, consider supporting me on Patreon.